everyone, this is Nikki Gratrix and welcome to the Abundant Energy Summit. Today I'm honoured to introduce to you a very important guest. It's Dr. Leonard Jason, who is a world-leading expert on the illness chronic fatigue syndrome, also known as ME, which stands for Myalgic Encephalomyelitis. Dr. Jason is a professor of psychology and the director of the Center for Community Research at DePaul University, Chicago. He is a former president of the Division of Community Psychology of the American Psychological Association, and he's received more than $34 million in federal grants and published over 600 articles, 77 book chapters, and 23 books on various subjects, including CFS-ME, as well as recovery homes, the prevention of alcohol, tobacco, and other drug abuse, media interventions, and program evaluation. He is also on the editorial boards of numerous academic journals, including the Journal of Health Psychology, Prevention and Intervention in the Community, the Journal of Community Psychology, and Fatigue, Biomedicine, Health, and Behavior. From 2006 to 2012, Dr. Jason was a member of the USA Government Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Advisory Committee and chair of the Research Subcommittee since 2007. And from 2004 to 2009, he was vice president of the International Association of CFS-ME. One of his latest books is called Principles of Social Change. It was published by Oxford University Press in 2013. Very interesting subject, very appropriate for this summit. It's available on Amazon. I'm hoping we might get a little chance to talk about this later, the book. But in the meantime, Dr. Jason, a very warm welcome to you, and thank you so much for spending time with us today and sharing your very important research findings with us.
Thank you.
So I guess to start, the most important thing we could really talk about is defining what we mean by fatigue, because the term is vague. It means different things to different people. Knowing the right sort of type that we have helps us understand how to address treatment. A lot of people on the summit, I think about just everybody feels a bit stressed and exhausted these days. Some of us think we might have chronic fatigue syndrome, and actually maybe we don't have it. And there might be others, in fact, do have it and don't realize. So what would be really useful is if you could share what are the key attributes of specifically chronic fatigue syndrome or ME, given there's no medical biomarker, there's no test for it at present. What are the key sort of items in the differential diagnosis based on your experience and research?
Sure, happy to answer that question. Everybody feels fatigue at some point. That means that fatigue is felt by 100% of the people listening to this broadcast. For some people, they feel fatigue only after a marathon race, but more often it's due to stress and having multiple responsibilities at work and with the family. So what I'm saying is that ordinary fatigue is experienced by everyone, but it's something very different from what we think of as chronic fatigue syndrome, CFS, or myalgic encephalomyelitis, ME. These illnesses are much more severe, and what is experienced by them is different from ordinary people experiencing fatigue. And I can't emphasize this point enough. People with ME and CFS have a lack of energy, endurance, and stamina to accomplish daily tasks of living. They also have cognitive problems with memory and concentration issues, unrefreshing sleep, and many other serious symptoms. One of the cardinal symptoms is post-exertional malaise. And what this means is that patients have a sudden onset of multiple symptoms when they exert themselves, which can occur during regular activity. However, because of the term chronic fatigue syndrome focuses so much on fatigue, when patients with ME or CFS say they're ill, others often say, gee, I have the same problem, but I keep working, even though I'm tired. Why can't you? In addition, people with these illnesses often have people say to them, hey, you look really good. You don't look sick. What's wrong? The combination of these different characterizations leads to incredible societal negative attributions toward many patients, which makes them almost like the 21st century lepers. To sum it up, there's terrible stigma associated with people with ME and CFS. Our society values energy and stamina and endurance more than anything else. It's probably more important than even money. And if you don't have stamina and energy, and people have difficulty providing an explanation for their condition, you're a person who's more discriminated than any other group. Patients with ME and CFS face a tremendous amount of skepticism, and so patients have to deal with a devastating illness, and then they're further victimized with an illness that a lot of people don't understand, and regrettably, a lot of people don't believe in.
This is so true. I'm afraid that's also my clinical experience with this as well. So it's so good that we can clarify this with a world expert like yourself and your research findings. So I think it would also be very useful to talk about the epidemiological data, the statistics, because I think there's misunderstandings about the types of people that get the illness, the severity and sort of prognosis and even impact on mortality rates. Perhaps you can share some of that work as well.
Sure. There was an initial myth that ME was more prevalent among yuppies, that is, young, upper-class, high-income, white individuals. That myth is not true. We found that in the U.S., ME and CFS tends to occur more often in minorities, that is, people of color. We did find, for example, Latinos had the highest rates of ME and CFS than any other group, and particularly among women Latinas. We also know that ME and CFS tends to be more common among individuals who have lower income. We did a community-based study even in Nigeria, and we actually found rates of ME and CFS to be higher than in the United States. So we think ME occurs around the world. ME and CFS does appear to occur more in women, but higher rates among women also occur with other autoimmune diseases. So in general, in our CFS epidemiology studies, we find that about maybe 1 in 200 people have this illness, which would actually indicate more than 1 million Americans have this particular illness. Studies have also found that this illness is debilitating as type 2 diabetes, congestive heart failure, multiple sclerosis, or end-stage renal disease. So we're talking about a really serious illness. Regarding prognosis, there have only been a few long-term studies involving individuals with ME. Some research suggests that those with longer illness time tend to have more cognitive difficulties and symptoms, but very few really recover from this illness. Some patients do improve over time, but they tend to still be impaired. My team worked with Dr. David Bell on a long-term follow-up study of youth who got sick in New York in the 1980s. We followed them up decades later, and many said that they had recovered. But when we compared their test finding to healthy controls, they were still very impaired. But their sense of recovery was based on them feeling so much better than the time of their illness that occurred during their teenage years. We do not know much about mortality, and we're doing a study on that right now. However, we did inspect the memorial list tabulated by the National CFIDS Foundation, and of the 166 deaths, the 3 most prevalent causes of death were heart failure, suicide, and cancer. The mean age of those dying from cancer and suicide was 47.8 years and 39.3 years, respectively. And these ages are considerably younger than deaths from cancer and suicide in the general population. Economic analyses in the U.S. have estimated the cost might be up to $20 billion a year. But the real cost to patients who have one of the most severe illnesses that we know, they've actually provided very little treatment. So here are individuals who have one of the most debilitating illnesses, and yet they're questioned about whether they really have an illness. Can you think of anything worse than being so sick and having people questioning whether you're really ill?
Yeah, that's so true. And it's so important to know that data, not just so that we are aware of the current people with this illness, but prevention. We need to know about this for prevention as well. Nobody wants to get this illness, really. Another huge misunderstanding is that often it's a misunderstanding between having depression and chronic fatigue syndrome. And these two things really are not the same thing in my clinical experience. What in your findings are the key psychological and physiological differences that you found in your experience and research between these two things?
Sure, very important question. With every chronic illness, some people will suffer from depression. So some people with ME and CFS will experience this, but the majority of patients with these conditions do not have depression. So you cannot conclude that this illness is caused by depression. Our group has been spending quite a few years trying to look at the differences between major depressive disorder, which is an illness distinct from ME and CFS. To put it briefly, if you had a person with major depressive disorder and you were to ask that person, if you were well tomorrow, what would you do? That person would say, I don't know. If you ask the same question to a person who suffers from ME or CFS, the person would start compiling a list of things that the person wanted to do but hasn't been able to because they're sick. The person with ME and CFS wants to get back to their former life and be once again active. The person with major depressive disorder is unsure about what to do with their life. In addition, we see with depression and ME and CFS are differentiated by what is called self-reproach. People with ME and CFS don't have self-reproach, which means blaming oneself and having negative personal feelings about themselves. People with major depressive disorder do suffer from self-reproach. In addition, people with major depressive disorder often feel better with exercising, and this is not the case with ME and CFS. Finally, several ME symptoms are not commonly found in depression, including night sweats, sore throats, and swollen lymph nodes. Illness onset with ME often occurs during a few hours or days, whereas primary depression generally shows more gradual onset. There are many studies that have actually found biological differences between people with major depressive disorders and conditions like ME and CFS. For example, cortisol levels generally tend to be lower in people with ME and CFS and higher with people with major depressive disorder.
Very important and very interesting. Particularly interesting because it seems that the current kind of government guidelines, both in the UK, Europe, and the USA, are very much based around a model that's based on a psychiatric form of, it's depression. So things like graded exercise, cognitive behavioral therapy, and antidepressants are the official guidelines, and yet, which is obviously based on the role of it being a depressive disorder. But a lot of patients find pacing is more appropriate. And in my clinical experience, people actually won't get better if they're not pacing properly. Would you be able to define the difference between, say, pacing and this sort of graded exercise that's recommended by the government guidelines, and your research around pacing as it helps chronic fatigue ME?
Sure, that's another very important question. There are many different types of medical treatments for many symptoms of ME and CFS, including the pain and sleep difficulties that patients experience. When a person has ME or CFS, it's important to treat all the patient's symptoms. Patients should be provided the best healthcare team, and the key to success is using both pharmacological and even non-pharmacological interventions to come up with a treatment program that meets all the individual's needs. There's a critical need for drug trials, as in the US, there's still not an FDA-approved drug for this condition. Most regrettably, many patients are not treated well by the medical establishment, and this is still due to the stigma that occurs for those with this illness. Too many healthcare workers consider it a psychological disorder, and they don't take it seriously in the many symptoms that the person has. Think of what it would be like if you had the energy of maybe 10 to 20% of what you now have. Patients with this illness have an energy battery that's severely depleted, and yet they have life obligations that require much more energy than they have. But they don't have the stamina to do all the things that are needed, such as shopping for food or taking care of their home or family. So the treatment challenge is to help patients deal with this problem of having far too much to do, which causes them to be exhausted and then crash or experience post-exertional malaise. The key is learning how to stay within their energy envelope, as we call it, and this is critical to allow their battery not to get further weakened. What occurs with many patients early on in their illness is that they feel like a yo-yo. They rest, they store up energy. When they feel a little better, they start doing things, taking care of responsibilities that are piled up. And these activities often cause a crash. I think that learning how to pace and stay within the energy envelope is key to having a better quality of life, but it will not cure patients. And this is something that Ellen Goodsmith in Great Britain has written about. Now, cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise is something used with all types of medical illnesses, but it's very controversial with ME and CFS. Let me explain why. Patients with ME and CFS are used these approaches to push them to exercise more, and they're also told that they have an illness that's being maintained by their self-defeating thoughts. Just think about it. If a person with cancer who needs medications was just told to do cognitive behavior therapy and that they did not have a biological illness, they'd be furious. But that's what's happening with ME and CFS patients. They have biologically based problems that need the best and most comprehensive medical care and treatment. And yet they're being siphoned to a very narrow type of psychological treatment. That's why patients are upset. with cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise. I believe that what patients can benefit from is learning to manage their available energy in a very individualized and tailored way. Patients need to be provided the best of medical care, and also they need to learn to stay within the available energy, to not exceed it, to not push themselves. Because if one does push oneself beyond their energy limits, they experience crashes, more post-exertional malaise, and I think this causes more oxidative stress to their brains. So I believe that pacing and learning to stay within the energy envelope can cause improvements, but they're not cures. When dealing with patients, healthcare workers need to recognize this is legitimate illness, and we need to work with patients to individualize the approaches. We can work to provide patients with the services they need to cope with this devastating illness and increase their quality of life.
Yes, it's very interesting. And I found in my experience that pacing is absolutely, it's a fundamental necessity for anything else to work, for any other intervention to work. So very important point to make as well. And also so true about this also being a biologically based illness. But like most chronic illnesses, there is a mental as well as a physical aspect. So very interesting paper that your group wrote recently, and that you've written more than one on this topic, which I thought was extremely interesting, was this etiological model of CFSME based on the idea of limbic kindling. So this is a model that was based on the core understanding of psychoneuroimmunology, which is a kind of an expansion of Hans Selye's original stress model. And just for our audience here, a brief summary is that essentially an intermittent stressor, which can be chemical, electrical, microbial, or psychological, can become hardwired into the brain, creating chronic stress and a cascade of changes through the body, through the limbic, hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis, can cause change in the immune system, opening it to things like opportunistic infections, certainly then increased oxidative stress, and eventually a key theme on this summit, which is which we explore in great detail, which is mitochondrial malfunction. I thought this was an excellent model. It brings so much together. We've really designed the whole summit around that. Would you like to tell us more about that?
Okay, and certainly this kindling is something that has been used to understand other illnesses like epilepsy. So let's kind of, again, just narrow in on what this kindling is. It occurs when an organism is exposed repeatedly to initially sub-threshold stimulus, resulting in hypersensitivity and spontaneous seizure-like activity. Among patients with ME and CFS, chronically repeated low-intensity stimulation due to an infectious illness might cause kindling to the limbic, hypothalamic, pituitary axis. Kindling might also occur by high-intensity stimulation, for example, brain trauma of the limbic, hypothalamic, pituitary axis. Once the system is charged or kindled, it can sustain a high level of arousal with little or no external stimulus. And eventually this could lead to reduction in cortisol. Seizure activity may spread to adjacent structures of the limbic, hypothalamic, pituitary axis in the brain, which might be responsible for the varied symptoms that occur among patients with ME and CFS. In addition, kindling may also be responsible for high levels of oxidative stress, which has been found in patients with ME and CFS. To better understand this phenomena, we need research that involves multidisciplinary efforts that will bring together scientists from different disciplines, including academics who are virologists, epidemiologists, individuals who study the autonomic nervous system, and genetics. This illness represents a great challenge to medicine. Physicians know how to fix a broken bone, but illnesses like ME and CFS are much harder and more complicated to treat and understand. But as we better understand these complex illnesses, we will get insight into many conditions that affect people. So to summarize, I believe great medical insights will occur with better understanding of this complex systemic illness known as ME and CFS. And as more scientists and researchers realize this, the best scientists in the world will begin to study what I think is one of the most neglected but most important medical illnesses facing our world. The status quo is not acceptable for patients with ME and CFS. It's only by us collectively being involved in action that the situation will change. And it has changed for many other illness groups, such as people with HIV/AIDS, who demonstrated that it's possible to bring about a sea change in the way people are treated and to help people change the way folks understand this illness. To bring about this type change is going to involve not just patients who have ME and CFS, but because many of them are sick. It's also going to involve people who are well along with the patients. The future of this field is connecting the many patient and scientific groups into one larger group and body that is united for change.
Fantastic. That's very interesting. And it ties to, could we talk a little bit about your book, which is called Principles of Social Change? Very much what we're trying to address here. I think it looks extremely interesting. I wish I'd had a chance to read it before I interviewed you. So perhaps you could give us a brief overview. And I think you talk about 5 principles of social change.
Yes. What I did was in 2013, had this book, Principles of Social Change, published by Oxford University Press, and tried to look at social change movements, individuals and groups that had successfully been able to make a difference for many patient groups and many social causes. And what I found was that, in a sense, people need to really think about how to bring about first order versus second order change. We really want to get not just cosmetic Band-Aid approaches to the types of problems that occur. We want to have more systemic, environmental, comprehensive solutions, what we call second order change. And to get them and to really make, for example, the experience of people with ME and CFS different so that they have access to services and are treated better, for example, we really sometimes need to think about dealing with some of the power structures that are in the world. And this has occurred with people with HIV/AIDS and people with many other illnesses. They had to deal with power structures who controlled resources. So if you're really going to bring about second order change, one needs to actually think about how we can think about challenging and getting some of the people who basically have the power to make the resources and to make the possibilities available for people to bring about change. So for ME/CFS, for example, funding levels are very low for research, and centers for clinical excellence are really needed. So if you have cancer, or if you have MS, or if you have many other illnesses, you can get into a clinic and get a diagnosis and an excellent treatment program. In the United States, if you have these illnesses, ME and CFS, there's no place to go. There's no specialists that are available throughout the United States. There are specialist centers, but often you can't get to them because there's some barriers to getting there in terms of location and fees. So we need to have places where people can go to get a diagnosis, where people can go to get treatment, and we also have money available for the resource and the research that's needed to basically better understand this illness. And the way we basically deal with that second order change and try to get those people, very powerful individuals who possibly prefer to have the status quo, is that we have to mobilize community groups and organizations and individuals. Partnerships have to be able to challenge those particular entities to get the resources that are needed. And to do that often involves a long-term time commitment where one has to be very patient and one has to constantly think about what types of small wins occur to sustain the energy to continue doing that. And as a psychologist, I would also say that we should be involved in thinking about documenting the change. So as we develop research methods to basically see whether we're getting to that second order change, whether we're challenging the people who have that power and the control of whether things are going to be available for people, we can basically document those social change movements by doing the types of research that we believe in. So yes, with ME/CFS, there's some very large goals that are needed. We really do need to provide services that aren't available now for many patients. We need to find better funding. And there's many other challenges for these people who have these very debilitating illnesses. And the way we basically work together is by having patient groups, individuals, researchers, government officials working together to basically try to figure out a way of changing the status quo, which unfortunately is often the thing that is the hardest to do because those in power often don't want to change.
That's so true and very interesting. So I actually encourage everybody to, perhaps if they're interested in this topic, to also have a look at Dr. Jason's book. I also highly rate the previous book that Dr. Jason wrote, which is The Handbook of Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, which is also an excellent book, is the handbook to the illness. It's still plenty of excellent information in there. And also, just lastly, Dr. Jason, do you want to share that you have a new study that you're working on, something you'd like to potentially ask some of the audience they might be interested to take part in your latest research study?
Sure. We know that individuals with ME and CFS have a variety of symptoms. There have been fewer studies that have tried to examine how patients might differ from individuals who have other types of illnesses. For example, kind of lupus or MS, which are autoimmune diseases, or cancer. So if there are people viewing who might be interested in filling out a questionnaire so that we can collect data on different illness groups and compare them to individuals that we already have data on, that would be extremely helpful, because ultimately we would like to come up with kind of an algorithm to basically say, okay, if you have these types of symptoms, you have this particular illness, and if you have these types of symptoms, you have another illness. So being able to discriminate these types of illnesses is very important from a scientific point of view.
Fantastic. There's a few pointers here. I think you've said the questionnaire takes approximately 45 minutes to complete. To be eligible, you need to be 18 years of age or above, able to read English, and have a diagnosis of lupus, multiple sclerosis, cancer, ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome. We're going to give out the link to the website address that Dr. Jason's provided for us. We will send that out. And in closing, thank you so much, Dr. Jason, for kindly sharing your time and information with us. Very fantastic for the audience and much appreciated. There's also a few other websites that we will be handing out as well. Primer for clinicians can be found on the iacfsme.org website. We'll be giving that one out too. And you can, if you want to see the paper by Dr. Jason's group on the limbic kindling model, it's available online just by Googling an etiological model for ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, and it's neuroscience and medicine. So thank you so much, Dr. Jason.
Thank you.
Fantastic. So take care, everybody, and hope to connect with everybody again soon on the next episode of the Abundant Energy Summit. But for now, take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.